Hey everybody, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you joining my 20-minute session, and I appreciate the SSC for having me as well. Today what we're going to be talking about is some of the issues and some of the problems that small businesses and startups face when they're trying to achieve PCI compliance and then maintain PCI compliance throughout the year. Quick introduction, my name is Marc Rubbinaccio. I'm from New York City. I've been in cybersecurity for about 10 years. First started off doing incident response in a data center, then moved on doing penetration testing, then was finally a QSA performing audits against PCI for about 3 years. And now I'm working for Secureframe, where we're building software to help businesses organize their compliance effort and manage it throughout the year. So what we're going to learn today is what are the common pitfalls and issues that these small businesses run into as they start to achieve PCI compliance and learn about what the compliance journey is going to take. What we're then going to do is learn about some of the resources that the PCI SSC has available to these small businesses and what they need to do in order to start to become compliant. And then we're going to discuss what are specific implementations and strategies and services that these companies can implement within their cloud solutions to meet those PCI requirements. All right, so first we're going to set the stage. Let's say you're a startup, you're 20 to 40 employees, half of those employees are engineers. You have money coming in, but you have an incredibly tight budget. And you're working with a prospective customer, and this customer needs a PCI compliance AOC, and that's because you're impacting their cardholder data. Maybe you've never heard of that acronym before. You're asking your colleagues what that means. You're Googling exactly what PCI is, and you pull up the report on compliance. And that's a 350 requirement page, difficult to interpret, and you're trying to figure out what your first steps are going to be to achieve this PCI DSS compliance. Maybe what you do at that point is you call up a couple organizations that you found online. And the first thing you're going to ask them is, hey, look, we have this prospective customer. They need an AOC from us. How long is this going to take? We need it as soon as possible. Now, what I've run into is not only do a lot of organizations reach out to Secureframe, and they're in this exact scenario where they need PCI compliance fast, but they don't know where to start. Also, what I've seen is a lot of customers come to Secureframe and they're already PCI compliant. They filled out a self-assessment questionnaire, they have an attestation of compliance, and then by the time that comes to me, I start reading through that SAQ, realize that maybe they haven't filled it out properly, or they're not meeting the intent of the requirements exactly as they're stated within the actual report. I've had an example of one customer that came to us. They had a filled out SAQ. They've been compliant for 2 years, but they just haven't been maintaining the continuous requirements throughout the year. Haven't had a pen test over the last year, haven't done ASV scanning. They're doing logging, but maybe they're not sending notifications against those security events. These are things that we worked with that customer, make sure that they had an implementation plan going forward. Also, another example, customer came to Secureframe. They had a self-assessment questionnaire filled out. Half of those requirements were marked as not applicable. Then I deep dove their network diagram, cardholder data flow diagram, talked to them about their actual service, and found out that a lot of those requirements were actually applicable. So at that point, we talked through exactly what they needed to implement in regards to security controls and got them on a plan to success. But before we talk about some of those in-depth pitfalls that a lot of these startups and small businesses run into, let's talk about what's PCI real quick. PCI DSS is a cybersecurity framework focused on cardholder data. If you're storing, processing, transmitting, or can impact the security of cardholder data, it's likely that you are required to be PCI compliant. Doesn't matter how big your business is. You could be a startup involved in the payment space, and likely PCI DSS is going to be applicable to your organization. The first main pitfall that I noticed that startups and small businesses have is they don't have a PCI expert on staff. They likely don't have a compliance expert on staff. They probably don't even have a security engineer on their team. A lot of the times, these organizations are spearheading the PCI compliance effort with developers, with the CTO, or even the CEO and founder is the one that's trying to achieve PCI compliance for this organization. What that means is they're downloading the report on compliance, and they're trying to interpret exactly what they need to do for their organization in order to meet the intent of those requirements. Another thing that I noticed is, and is very important for PCI DSS, is scoping. For this organization, in order to determine exactly what part of their environment is in scope for PCI DSS. They need to determine what their cardholder data environment is. They need to determine what their connected to systems are and ensure that their isolated systems and platforms are properly segmented. That's pretty difficult to do if you don't have a PCI expert on staff. And then leading into everything else, implementation of all your security controls comes down to readiness, ensuring that your organization is fully ready when it comes down to that third-party audit. Readiness is something that requires a lot of expertise and understanding the security controls that you need to implement in order to be ready for that PCI DSS third-party attestation does require some expertise on your end. Next is going to be the actual budget. A lot of small businesses and startups have an incredibly tiny budget, and they need to factor in a lot of things in order to achieve PCI DSS with their limited budget. The first thing is that if it's the founder, CTO developers that are trying to achieve PCI compliance, they're probably better off building the platform, growing the actual company, and being competitive within their space instead of spending all of these hours trying to interpret exactly what they need to implement for PCI DSS. In regards to the budget, there's also a lot of requirements that require third-party services and additional tooling that they need to make sure that they're budgeting for. These are things like a penetration test, ASV scanning, internal vulnerability scanning if they don't have tools for that, antivirus software, centralized mobile device management. These are things that are going to come into play once they start reading through that report on compliance, and they're going to have to budget for. And then, of course, if they do need a third-party audit, they would have to reach out to a QSA firm and then pay that QSA firm for an audit. PCI audits, especially level 1 audits, are not incredibly simple. The QSA is going to either come on site or do remote. They're going to perform a lot of interviews, observations. They're going to be reviewing evidence, and they're also going to be writing a detailed report. These audits are not exactly cheap, and that's because of all the effort that goes into the PCI audit. So it's important that these small businesses take all of that into consideration. The next pitfall is just lack of planning. A lot of the times these startups, they're running into PCI compliance when they reach out to a prospective customer, they're doing due diligence against them, and then they realize that, oh, we need this AOC in order for this customer to onboard with us. Or they happen to be within the actual payment space itself, and they're reaching out to their payment processors. They're reaching out to a payment gateway or an acquiring bank, and in order to turn on these services, they need an attestation of compliance. So what does that mean for the business? They need it as soon as possible to start getting in that revenue from these different streams. And then, of course, continuous monitoring. It's incredibly easy for a startup throughout the year to just kind of forget about compliance because they're too busy trying to grow the platform. They're too busy trying to compete with their other small businesses and trying not to go under and trying to exponentially grow the business. This is where continuous monitoring could fall by the wayside, but it is fairly simple to start organizing these things, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now that you understand what are some of the pitfalls that small businesses and startups run into, let's talk about how do we get started, right? So PCI SSC, thankfully, has a ton of great resources available online. I would recommend reviewing the scoping and segmentation guide, which will allow you to understand exactly how to scope your environment. There's the PCI DSS 4.0 document, which has all of the PCI requirements as well as some guidance available that can help you get started when it comes to implementing those things. Next is the prioritized approach, which I think is an incredibly valuable tool for startups and small businesses. This document will allow you to understand exactly in which order you should be focusing on these security requirements. And then you can also state if you have things in place already, if you may have things in place, or if you don't at all, and then also assign responsibilities within that document as well. It's a great place to be able to project manage this entire PCI journey. Next, if you are in the cloud, PCI does have cloud guidelines as well. Now let's kick things off. First thing you need to do as a startup or a small business is determine what level of PCI compliance you need. There's 4 different levels. Level 1 requires a third-party audit, report on compliance. Level 2, likely you need to attest against your SAQ. Level 3, 4, it's possible that you only need to fill out that self-assessment questionnaire, and then you can submit that to your customers and things like that. If you are a service provider, it's likely your customers that are going to be the ones that are requesting PCI compliance from you. It's those folks that you would reach out to and be like, hey, what level of compliance do you think we need? They'll tell you, and you'll be able to kind of tackle that PCI compliance from there. If you're within the payment channels, that's when it's likely a payment processor, gateway, or acquiring bank are going to be the ones that are requesting PCI compliance from you. You're going to reach out to them and see exactly what level that you need at that point. Verifying PCI DSS scope is a critical initial thing that you would need to do prior to even implementing controls, I believe. Understanding exactly what your environment is that's in scope, what environment may be out of scope, is critical to understanding what security controls you need to implement as an organization. And then we talked about reviewing controls to understand what the additional costs are, making sure you have the budget, and that's not going to be a wall that you're going to have to crash through as you're making your way through the PCI journey. And then, of course, the project planning, something like utilizing the prioritized approach, getting all of the personnel that you need involved, and then understanding which controls are priority versus which ones are not. Now we could talk a little bit about what are some of the different controls that you can implement and what are strategies in order to do so. I like to break down the different requirements into two different controls, operational and technical. Operational controls, we could start with policies and procedures. All of the requirements require some sort of policy and procedure attached. Great way to understand, to think about it is for each sub-requirement, associating a policy or procedure process statement to that sub-requirement. So for example, if you're doing internal vulnerability scanning, stating in your policy that it's your engineers that are performing a vulnerability scanning quarterly, they're utilizing this certain tool to do so, and then results are followed up on via an SLA or something like that. Next is onboarding and offboarding, which falls into a lot of different requirements. One in particular is access control, making sure that access granted, access changed, access revoked is not only documented because the auditor is going to request documentation for that when the audit comes, but also managed. You need to approve changes that are made. You need to review the changes that are made and make sure that they're following the PCI requirements there. Next is change management. Change management are things like software changes or infrastructure changes, making sure that these are documented and making sure that these are reviewed, approved, security testing is being performed, all important for PCI DSS, and making sure that you're doing that, incredibly important. Next is risk management, making sure that all of your operational risks and technical risks are being accounted for throughout the year. Operational risks can be discovered via things like business continuity tabletop exercises or security team meetings that you have throughout the year. Technical risks, these are things that can be discovered via pen tests, vulnerability scan, RSS feeds that are sending you vulnerability information based on the platforms and environment that you have within your organization. Performing that annual risk assessment is important, but also for PCI 4.0, there is some risk validation that just needs to occur throughout the entire DSS. And that is in regards to your regular reviews. So let's say you may be more susceptible to a breach and you believe that penetration testing is important for your organization. That's something you can consider to have performed more regular than annually, maybe quarterly, or introducing a bug bounty program or something like that could be important for your organization. Next, let's jump into some technical controls. We'll kind of run through these a little bit. First, segmentation, not exactly required, but if you do have a more complex organization, it could be beneficial for you to understand what networks, what services, what personnel don't actually need or have access to cardholder data, and then you can kind of scope that environment out. And the way that you could do that is via the scope and segmentation guidance. You can learn exactly how to do that. Now let's talk about some of the security services that the cloud offers. Let's say you're an AWS, Azure, GCP. There's a lot of services that the cloud offers that you can spin up and meet PCI requirements for. First thing I want to talk about is the IAM. IAM is a great way to manage group policy, authentication controls such as multi-factor, password requirements, things like this. You can manage via IAM. You could also grant temporary access. So if a person only needs access to a specific resource for a certain amount of time, you could set that policy and have that access automatically terminated after that time. And then IAM gives you a holistic view of all the access, so you can easily review everything within your cloud platform. Next is security groups, which is just another name for like firewall rules, making sure that ingress, egress traffic is specifically regulated, making sure that ports, protocols, IP addresses, all of that is restricted to only the required bit of business. And then your cloud platform is an easy way where you can actually see all of your security groups and review them all easily within that cloud platform itself. Next, let's talk about vulnerability scanning. Every cloud service provider has some sort of vulnerability scanning, whether you're running virtual machines, you're running containers, you have other sort of resources like file systems or databases. You can use tools like AWS Inspector, Azure, Defender for Cloud to run internal vulnerability scanning, and you can spin that up with the click of a button. Next is logging and monitoring. This is an incredibly important aspect to the DSS, and there's security tools that allow you to do that within the cloud. Things like CloudTrail, where you can log all of the actions that are being taken within your resources, all of the tasks that are happening there, and then utilizing event filtering to filter things for administrative access, for critical file system changes, for actual changes to the logging service itself. These are all PCI requirements. You could spin up these events within the tool pretty fairly easily. Next is things like IDS, IPS. There are tools and services where you can spin up in the cloud pretty fairly easily that are going to monitor network traffic and then try and deny anything that could be malicious or something like that. DLP is something that I always recommend to our customers, especially if they have a focused subset of resources that are storing cardholder data. What they can do is just ensure that if cardholder data kind of exists anywhere else where it shouldn't be, that DLP technology is going to go ahead and notify them. It's going to mask that card number automatically, or can actually block that card number from being stored or transmitted wherever it should not be. Key management services, web application firewall, these are just some additional tools and services that the cloud offers for you to take advantage of and easily meet some of these PCI requirements, meeting the actual intent of these requirements. All right, great. So let's say you went ahead, you completed the prioritized approach document, you have all of your security controls in place as per the PCI regulation and the requirement, the standard. Next step would be to either fill out your SAQ, if that's all you need to do, attest to that SAQ, or reach out to a QSA. The PCI SSC has a list of approved QSAs on their website, and then there's also a ton of QSAs here at the conference. So what you would do is build a relationship with this QSA. They would come in, they would review your scope, network diagram, cardholder data flow diagram, things like this, ensure that your scope is accurate. Then what they'll do is schedule interviews, observations, make sure that the evidence that you're providing to their portal is indeed meeting these security requirements, and then also reviewing that evidence to then submit a draft report. Once you receive that draft report, that's when you can review it and then submit it to whoever you need be. And at that point, you are indeed PCI compliant. But that's not the end-all be-all. There are a lot of controls and requirements that you have to maintain throughout the year. This is something that's critically important, and easily, if you're focused on your business and you don't have a cybersecurity compliance team to really focus on these tasks throughout the year, they're easily missed. And if you're missing some of these requirements when it comes time for that annual audit at the end of the year, you could run into an absolute ton of issues and headaches. And this is something where I would highly recommend you review and make sure you have a process in place to maintain these regular requirements. Now, I know I talked to you all about PCI DSS, and I'm sure a lot of you already know what that is. As a matter of fact, I'm probably in a room with some of the smartest PCI DSS people in North America. But I really appreciate you coming here and listening to me talk about some of the things that I've seen over the last couple of years. Personally, at Secureframe, I've been working with strictly startups, small businesses, these folks that don't have compliance expertise. They don't have an ISA on staff. I've talked to some organizations that have 12 ISAs, and they have the expertise that they need to really understand what they need to do. These startups and small businesses, they're getting these requirements, and they're not exactly sure what they need to implement to meet the intent of these requirements. I remember when I was a QSA, I was working with some of my colleagues to actually determine what evidence I should be reviewing to meet the intent of the requirements. Imagine you're a CEO or a founder and you have a marketing background. You're downloading the report on compliance template, and now you're trying to figure out what controls you need to implement in order to be PCI compliant. A lot of the customers that we receive are submitting a self-assessment questionnaire for us, and we're deep diving their controls and realizing that not everything they have in place is meeting these requirements to a T. So I think what we need to do as an industry of PCI folks that really understand the framework is to not only give guidance to a lot of these small businesses and startups, because they all need to be PCI compliant too, but really help them understand what it is they need to implement, how to meet these requirements, that they're not so scary. There are easy ways to meet these controls by really understanding what they need to do. Quick 20 seconds left. At Secureframe, what we're doing is we're building software to help these small businesses and startups maintain their PCI compliance and understand what it takes to implement these controls. We automate evidence collection, and we automate a lot of the results via technology integrations. We can show them exactly what is compliant right now, what is not compliant. We map all of that to PCI requirements. We give them a place where they can organize all of their tests, all of their tasks, an easy way for them to really understand where they're at today and what they need to do in order to become compliant. Thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and looking forward to chatting after the talk. Thanks, everyone.